Hello, and welcome to the From Truth to Action podcast. I'm Jay Hurtubise, Director of Community Standards at Framingham State.
And I'm Ben Trapnick, Director of New Student and Family Programs, also at Framingham State. And we're honored to be bringing you this limited series, exploring the ways that biases and systemic racism impact our communities. Each episode will be looking at personal stories and real events with our guests in order to frame our discussion and lead us to anti-racist action.
As always, we want to provide our audience with a trigger warning due to the deeply sensitive and often traumatic nature of racism, inequity, and injustice. We also encourage you to practice effective self-care, however that looks for you. And we remind you about your on-campus support resources, which may include counseling centers, campus ministries, and also campus contacts for multicultural affairs, diversity, or inclusive excellence.
In Charlottesville, Virginia, white students make up 40% of the city's student enrollment, and African American students about a third. But white children are about 4 times as likely to be in Charlottesville's Quest Gifted program, while black students are more than 4 times as likely to be held back a grade and almost 5 times as likely to be suspended from school. Since 2005, the academic gulf between white and black students in Charlottesville has widened in nearly all subjects, including reading, writing, history, and science. As of last year, half of all black students in Charlottesville could not read at grade level, compared with only a tenth of white students. Black students in Charlottesville lag on average about 3.5 grades behind their white peers in reading and math, compared with a national gap of about 2 grades. Over the decades, school board members have often brushed aside findings of racial inequality in Charlottesville schools, including a 2004 audit commissioned by the district's first African American superintendent that blamed inadequate leadership and a history of racism for the persistent underachievement of its black students. The current superintendent, Dr. Rosa Atkins, believes that it is unfair to compare black students with white classmates who attended the best preschools and have traveled abroad. The experiences that they bring into our school system are very different, she said. I'm not trying to make excuses for the test scores of black students, said Atkins, but that's only one measure of where they are and who they are and their capabilities for success. When we start saying that until you start performing like white children, you have a deficit, I think that in itself is discrimination. The New York Times on Charlottesville, 2018.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the From Truth to Action podcast. I'm Jay Hurtubise, one of your hosts, and I'm joined by my co-host, Ben.
How are you, Jay? Ben Trapnick. Thank you for coming today, everybody.
Yeah, we're glad to have the audience. We're glad to have you, Ben. We're very glad to have our esteemed guest, Mr. Joseph Corazzini, who is the Assistant Superintendent at Framingham Public Schools for Equity, Diversity, and Community Development. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you because our topic today, obviously, we're talking about education, bias, and anti-racism in the education field. And I've already seen some press, Metro West Daily News, some things, articles they wrote about you and some of your stances on anti-racism and what we can do. And so we're really excited to get our conversation going and get talking about what our community members can do. But first, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your position, and how you became interested in this topic?
So, I'm by trade a youth worker. I don't really exactly know how I got here. Just sort of kept chasing sort of the dream of like inclusion. And, really honestly started with going down to my middle school as a senior in college. I was studying to be a computer science engineer. And I was asked to come and sort of really mentor young people at my old middle school. And in that experience, what I saw was a lot of the same sort of things I saw as a kid, but I was re-seeing them again as an adult. Mm-hmm. And all of it was sort of systemic and based, right? Like seeing kids use the same textbooks that I used like years prior, seeing some of the same challenges between sort of students, and administration, and teaching and staffing, seeing some of the hardship of like poverty from like just a different lens about like kids who are like really succeeding. And then other kids who had less resources that weren't. And that really started to drive me into working with kids, working with young people. And I worked through experiential programs, gap year programs, college access readiness programs. And that work eventually led me to coming into the district as the director of community resource development. And the district I worked to, when I came in, it was just literally an office of one and a half. I had a part-time staff member, and through just like strategic planning and working and community resources, we were able to develop a new model for out of school time and to build some really collaborative and innovative partnerships with the district. And then when Superintendent Tremblay came on as new superintendent after some transition between the last superintendent and interim superintendent, he asked me to sort of lead the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Community Development. So that office really works. So I call it sort of like the table, if you will, for like family engagement, for adult learning, for early childhood expansion, for student registration, like anything that's sort of community facing. Like this office sort of helps to sort of coordinate or organize. So I get to be the face for a lot of amazing people and a lot of great work in the district, and to really sort of put diversity and inclusion, and specifically equity and anti-racism at the forefront in terms of all this work, right? And it was intentional in terms of when we were developing this. Like I wanted to take on this work, but I also wanted to have these departments as part of this office because they're so family oriented and they're so community facing, that I needed this to be able to drive the work, right? Because families lead this work, and when it's challenging for institutions to move this work, our community will be the motivator in terms of pushing us forward. So part of what we're going to do this work and see it through was to ensure that there was some kind of mechanism to keep challenging us as we try to work to become an anti-racist school district.
And Joe, can you just give a little background on the population of Framingham Public Schools?
Yeah, well, Framingham's got over 9,000 students, probably around 1,200 staff members. We have our white population is probably, I think, around like 65% white. In there, it's a little tricky because we have students who identify white, but also are sort of first generation Brazilian Americans or second generation Brazilian Americans. Framingham is a large Brazilian, beautifully amazing Brazilian American community, and we have, I think, around 7% Black students, somewhere around the 20-25% Latino students. So it's a really over 76 different languages are spoken within our schools. So high representation from across the world, and just amazing diversity that's brought into our district that we value. And
of those numbers as well, because Jay and I work here at Framingham State, we're somewhat familiar with the area. You have a large number of ESL, correct, in your district as well?
We do. We have a lot of students who are multilingual, students who are acquiring a second, and for some instances a third language, and it's an amazing resource and tool to have if you think about sort of like the end. For some kids 18 years out, to be able to leave a school district and have fluency in their language, have fluency in a second language, and for some of those other students, fluency potentially 2 or 3 different languages. So I think while some districts and while some people see that as sort of being like a deficit based, from our purposes, our lens, it's an asset. Having young people who are able to utilize their skills, their personal skills, professional skills in multiple markets across the world. So we're excited about that. And you see,
so you're looking at the equity from multiple lenses. It's not just about race; it's also about language and some other things as well. So we're Jay and I were coming to it from a bit of a racial and equity standpoint, but you're also looking at equity from multiple perspectives.
Well, you have to, right? Because one, race is important, but people in terms of their identities aren't singular. So there's intersectionality is crucial, and so while there's a history in terms of like Black folks and my family in terms of slavery coming up in this country, there's also Black Brazilians that exist. There's Black Dominicans. There's Black Puerto Ricans, right? Like there's folks who have darker skin whose descendants come from Africa, who may have experienced a form of slavery through a different country and a different context, but equally are sharing in sort of the oppressive nature of the aftermath and discrimination that takes place for many of our folks who are darker skin. And so the contextualizing it and understanding how intersectionality works is important, because it creates a space for everybody to be able to be included in the conversation around the work that we have to do in terms of deconstructing white supremacy.
Thanks for including that background information. It's helpful. it's helpful for people to see that there's just more than one. Everybody's focused. A lot of people right now are focusing on race or whatever, and it's helpful to see the intersectionality of different people and what they bring to the table and stuff like that. And what you have to, as someone who works within the system, you also have to be thinking about all the different identities as well. So thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate it, Joe. Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, actually, kind of going off that, it makes me think about, we were just saying how there's so much intersectionality, right? But the idea that society likes to focus on one thing at a time, if we start to talk about multiple things, it sometimes feels like society's like, well, we give up. That's just too much, right? And I think I read this in the Metro West Daily article, that you wrote, that some people, it just feels like they're apathetic.
Yeah, listen, we were in New England, right? People love sports. Ask anybody, Tom Brady stats over the last 3 or 4 years, or stats going back to like 2002, and they can contextualize like how he was great in the short game, struggled in the long game, how, where the Patriots are every moment of every week in terms of like their actual field play. Is the running game great? Is defense horrible, right? Like, so we have an ability to differentiate, and there's an ability to be critical in terms of things that we're passionate about, right? And also still have affection and love for it. So I think that, folks have to lean in on the work. If you can understand the idea that you can like be frustrated with the Patriots and the system, but also love the Patriots, then you can understand why people are like, yo, I hate oppression and I hate racism, but I love America, right? And so it's all about contextualization and people like actually, one, being opening to listening, two, being humble in terms of like their lack of knowledge and their limited knowledge in terms of any area, right? Like I'm Black, like there's places where I face oppression because of that, right? Where that's historical in nature. I'm also a man. And so there's places where I face privileges and I got to be conscious of that, right? And while as a Black man, I can understand oppression, I also am cisgendered, so I don't necessarily understand the same level of oppression, right? I can empathize with it, but to some extent, but I can't necessarily feel it compellingly of what it means to be like maybe like trans, right, or queer, and to live that as like a queer or trans person of color, right? But in the place of sort of like understanding oppression in terms of access, if I can engage in the work, right, then I create the space to say that any kind of oppression, regardless if it's one that I can fully understand or connect with or not, is wrong. And I can engage in my activism around the work showcases my part as an individual in this country, in the system, to contribute to the dismantling of it, right? So the idea is like, you don't got to be trans to know that trans lives matter. You don't got to be queer to know queer lives matter. You don't got to be Black to know Black lives matter. If at the very basis, it's about the affirmation of somebody's life. And history and data is very compelling in terms of showing very real sort of like what's happening in our country and the impact of it. And all we have to do is sort of speak to that about why we need to deconstruct and how we deconstruct, and then let that be the guide. Now, there's some folks that don't really like to vibe with that, and they're just like, like, well, all lives matter and all this other kind of stuff. And, my approach really with that is to try to be open and come from like a sort of a love-centered space, but to always speak justice to it. So like, yeah, like all lives do matter, and I can say that. But if you have an issue, if you saying all lives matter, you have an issue going into further detail, that's, I guess, where we have some difficulty, because that to me showcases that either there's an unwillingness or there's or a lack of education, and either of those spaces makes me uncomfortable. And we got to sort of push in as to why you feel either unwilling or why you're uneducated about some of these issues, right? And if you're uneducated, it's cool. Get humbled and get educated. But don't put it on people of color to be the ones who are educating you,
Yeah, I love that perspective. I mean, it's another purpose, another reason. Like Ben and I, every time we meet with a guest, we're like, that's why we're doing the podcast. It's like just getting people to be able to reframe the concept. To just that idea that, like the New England Patriots example you were giving, just the idea that if you can, be critical of something that you're passionate about, you can still love it. It can still be valued, and it can still be worth working on. I think that's sometimes lost on a lot of people that we meet, or we at least feel like it's lost on them because we haven't been able to take the time, and really talk to them about it. So thank you for kind of reframing that.
Yeah.
Ben, you look like you had something to say.
No, I'm good. Go ahead, Jack. Do what you need to do.
All right. So I wanted us to take a look back because our audience just a little while ago heard the New York Times, an excerpt from the New York Times article on the disparities, the growing disparities in education in the public school system in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, Charlottesville, obviously known in the news for what had occurred there during the Trump administration, but the article was really talking a lot about what was happening in their education system and the reasons why they kind of uncovered why it was happening in their education system. And I just wanted to get, looking back at that excerpt, what are your initial thoughts? What speaks to you in it?
Systems, right? Historically, systems create the tension, right? You can look at Charlottesville. You can go look at sort of what happened with Missouri when the young brother, Michael, I'm forgetting his last name, but he was murdered in the streets of Missouri. Michael Brown. Right? Michael Brown. There's an actual white paper on sort of like housing and the changes that happened in that state and that community, specifically around the moving of affordable housing around and how it actually created, right? It facilitated the indoctrination of people into poverty, specifically Black folks. So when you go into these communities, and government historically creates these practices of policies that are based around bias, right? They started from a place of thinking that Black people specifically were others, that they were not having the same type of rights as whites, and that they weren't up to the level of the same kind of education or services or whatever, right? There's a bias that was based around that from folks that created that, right? This isn't made up out of thin air. And those policies and practices that were created things in people's lives that created negative impacts. And then at the end, we see all these things sort of played out in terms of the way in which the people behave. Let me tell you something. Poverty is a driver for alcoholism, for drug addiction, for stress, for anxiety, for depression, leads to heart disease, right? Like all the things that in our world's ills are very much can be linked very easily in terms of data to high levels of poverty, right? Because those things accelerate the ways in which the stress is on families. So if we know this information, if we know that government created this, right, then why aren't we doing more, or why are we so shy about reflecting on this and asking ourselves, like, how do we deconstruct this, right? Like people here oftentimes, like with Black Lives Matter, they defund the police, and they're like, I've heard a lot of different sort of perspectives. There's folks that are just like, what do you do without the police? And the folks saying that's a bad slogan, and it doesn't really get to sort of the heart of the matter. But the idea around what they're trying to say is that you've got to deconstruct what was constructed to actually get to the heart of like solving the fundamental problem, right? Like if you have systems that were created and put into place that were developed by folks who had the wrong mentality or wrong intentionality on like what they were sort of utilized for and how they can help, then we've got to get to a place of like being very sort of bare and raw about reimagining sort of what it could look like potentially in the future. What does affordable housing look like in a way that is dignified, right? I remember coming up and having friends that were like on welfare, and some family members that were on welfare, and they used to have like the big like paper things, the checks or whatever, and then they moved to like the cards. I remember people being like, they should have the paper thing because people should be ashamed when they have to go to the grocery store so they don't abuse the system. And I was like, whoa, like there's a lot of energy and anger and assumptions around poverty and folks who are impoverished that are like all about blaming like people who are poor. Not about the fact that like you have corporations that like Walmart that manipulate the government, right? Like how many folks who are like working for that company who are working full-time jobs and also qualifying for federalized programs. So major corporations, and I don't know if they're a sponsor or not, but I'm throwing it out anyways, that basically pimp the way in which the federal government system works. Now, folks will be like, they'll be so quick to damn the poor, but they don't turn that same eye towards the corporations that facilitate that structure, right? Like nobody, like who's out there calling for like, yo, like let's talk about the fact that we have businesses that are multi-billion dollars in exploiting government assistance systems and actually creating generations of like, they're perpetuating the creation of generations of like impoverished communities. That's not cool, right? And it doesn't take, like you have other companies like Costco. Costco supplies medical health care to like I think all of their like or a larger percentage of their workers, right? So you can still be rich and extraordinarily rich and also do what's in the right interest for people in the community. And I think that what people need to always think about is like, like the interplay of like history and systems and how they connect. Too oftentimes we get caught up in like the case scenario of like, well, this isn't racism because of this particular incident. Is this isn't racism because of this? And it's just like, whoa, time out. Like, let's not act like slavery didn't happen. Let's not act like segregation was like 100 years ago. Let's not act like Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow, it didn't take place. Like, let's actually be humble in the idea of understanding like the ways in which people of color explicitly are trying to express that they're still facing barriers because of these systemic issues. And then as institutional leaders, including myself, like, we all got a responsibility. I always say, like, I wasn't around when all this took place. Most of this took place. I am around today, and I own the past history of that, and I got to be responsible for it. But I also have to be responsible for reviewing current, consistently how our practices today also perpetuate some of the ills of the past. I use BLM as an example, especially because folks get tied up on sort of All Lives Matter and the Blue Lives Matter, and it's like they're coming for police. And like, I think that in any movement, you can't really control the narrative, because the idea of movements is that they're not necessarily like the old school civil rights way of like the spokesperson doesn't exist no more, right? Like when you assassinate civil rights leaders, Dr. King, Malcolm X, then movements change, right? So the decentralized way in which movements have changed, where it's like everybody has a voice, just means you can't control what people say. So what an individual says may not necessarily be representative of the whole group, but I think sometimes they get taken out of context. All that simply to say is that, you can't really, we don't want to dismantle sort of what people's arguments are in terms of like their message, because one person is an outlier. Look at the core of sort of what they're arguing for. And I think what BLM is arguing for is like, we've got to police differently in in communities, right? Like we're putting officers in the place of responding to incidents that are clear mental health crises. There are clear biases that are taking place that we're seeing play out in terms of video cameras. That doesn't take away from the good work that good officers are doing, but it doesn't also brush away the bad things that are happening for the officers who are behaving poorly. And we're not willing to sweep it aside or ignore it. We're putting it on, cameras are giving vision to Black experiences that have been happening for years. And people have to be willing to dig deep and say, damn, even if it wasn't me, even if it wasn't in my community, even if I am an officer and do the right thing, even if I am a teacher, do the right thing, even if I am an assistant superintendent and do the right thing, I've also got to be as vocal about the wrong things that are happening and why they're wrong, so that we calibrate our communities to think like, like that kind of stuff is wrong. And it's not even like there's no benefit of the doubt. Like when we see wrong, we know wrong, right? And I think that part of what happens is people are not educated, and then people are, bigoted. I mean, that's the truth, right? There's people that discriminate and they're apologetic about it. There are people that are dismissive, and then there are people that are just frustrated and worn out, right? And you got to create, there's got to be a consciousness around what people bring to the table and where they're at in terms of this work, so we can have multiple strategies. One strategy ain't gonna work.
Joe, you said so many things in that, and there's I had like 6 things that I was going to interject in there.
Always feel free to cut me off. I get on a tangent sometimes. I'm a verbal processor.
You talk about a couple of systems, and a couple of things. Like I just want to go back real quick. Maybe it's just me wanting to add it in, but like you talk about how corporations, are taking advantage of all this stuff. But let's keep in mind too. To agree with you, not only are they feeding into the systemic racism, but they're also not paying the taxes for a lot of the stuff that the governments are providing for them as well. And they make the argument like, well, we put so much into our tax economy and this and that. But when you're at, so that was just one thought I had. And the second thought I had is similar, you work in the education system similar to the police, the criminal justice, or at least the policing system. They're also, both systems are being asked to do things that they are not originally intended to be doing. Mm-hmm. Like you talk about mental health crises and police are first responders and this and that. They're not trained extensively to be mental health providers, and how, they're taught in de-escalation and things like that nowadays, a lot of them. But same thing with the education system. You're told, you need to do it, but you're also talking about feeding, when it comes to the intersection between education and poverty and home insecurity and all those things. And the systems are stretched so thin. And again, please don't misunderstand me for saying that, the police, are excusing them for what some of them have done. I'm not saying that at all. But when you come back to the defund the police, it really comes back to I think the message is defund them from things that they don't need to be doing. and put those monies into places that of experts and figure out ways to do it so it's done appropriately and helping victims, or things like that, as opposed to having a police somehow, because they know how to de-escalate, and then they take them in handcuffed or put them in a cell to have them calm down, and then bring the mental health counselor in from there. Now you've entered the system. Same thing for education system. And, we had some questions on the whole pipeline to prison, type of thing as well. So there are so many, the systems is so, you said it so well in so many different ways, but the examples you gave are all systemic problems, and the bar continually gets moved. And we're watching it happen this past week, like with the voting in Georgia as well. So the bar continually gets moved when things happen to extend those things. So a lot of
the system fights back, right? You get your first Black and Jewish U.S. senators in the state of Georgia, which I think, from somebody who's, I call myself the grandchild of the South because my family, my mother's side is from Alabama, Tuscaloosa, represent, and you just know from the South, like this, it's just a different world than it is up north. And so to have like a Jewish senator and a Black senator be elected in the same election, like that's years of like progress happening within sort of like an organized effort. But as you said, like then you have the resolve of sort of the change in the Voting Rights Act. And, I would argue that that's inherently racist. Like it's done, the change in those voting laws has been done to primarily attack and Black votes, right? And I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. If you look at the counties and the communities that they're going after and the methods that they're going after, those are methods that were created to increase voter activism, right? And it's like the idea of like historically look back, right? So our job is to not necessarily indoctrinate kids into our own political beliefs, but to resonate and to rise questions that sort of allow us to reflect. What were some of the past practices used against the Black community in terms of voting to prohibit them from voting, right? You had to pass a test, right? Like this is not 100 years ago. This is like a few decades ago. So there's different strategies. The times change. The system bucks back and says, we don't really want your representation. So we're going to try to do things to slow it down. And that's the reality around it. And I'm not saying that everybody who believes that, believes in sort of voting security is inherently sort of racist. But I think the practice of it has been proven to be systemically racist. Like it's whether an individual believes it or not, or knows it or not, those are strategies that have been used to keep communities of color from accessing the opportunity to vote. And so I think our job is just to engage in this conversation with young people and with each other. And that's what part of being anti-racist is. You're actually taking action on a daily basis to reflect, evaluate how we can deconstruct sort of some of these systems and practices that continue to create hardship for our communities.
Okay. Well, if it's okay with you, Joe, I have a couple questions, some of which are based on that article. And just to get into a little bit more specifics, again, systemically we're talking about, not necessarily individual districts or whatever, but from the New York Times article, I'm going to quote, what does not show up in test scores is how far behind Black children start and how they sometimes have to acquire 2 years worth of skills in just 1 year. Mm-hmm. From your experience in working in school districts and equity, can you talk a little bit about some of the reasons why children of color are starting behind their white counterparts?
Opportunity. And that's why I stopped talking about the achievement gap, because the achievement gap implies that like students are like sort of at a deficit. And what I would say is that students haven't been given an opportunity. So the individual student is not is not a deficit, right? They're not lacking more so individual skill sets, more so lacking opportunities to access resources or opportunities to give them the skill sets that they need to develop. And so out of school time, which is where I sort of honed a lot of my skills working in our school time programs and youth development organizations, there's research that's very clear that we've had for years that says like, by the time kids, low-income students go from grade kindergarten to middle school, that they're going to hit like a 6,000 hour gap in terms of learning. And the way they equate that in terms of research is like you look at preschool access, you look at access to available and high quality before and after school programs, summer program enrichment programs, tutoring services, simple things like visits to museums or to the library. All of those things are additional opportunities for learning, right? That aren't just sort of solely based in terms of like academic content. So that right there in itself, by just from, our low-income students to, compared to their counterparts from K to middle school, that's 6,000 hours right there in terms of learning that they miss. And that's research-based, on average. Then you look at sort of like, I always use I reference Malcolm X's quote where he talks about sort of the cycle of poverty. Again, like 1956, he's doing like a rights to Second Amendment, rights to bear arms speech in Harlem. And he starts off by talking about sort of systemic oppression. And he uses the example of like, if you're a poor kid in a poor neighborhood, you're destined to go to a poor school. Go to a poor school, you're destined to get a poor education. Poor education, you're destined to get a poor paying job. You can't afford to live anywhere else. So then you got to live right back in that poor neighborhood. And it's a vicious cycle. He does it way more eloquent than I can ever say it, but he conceptualizes in very clearly in a vivid form the cycle of poverty that many of our communities of color face. And so when students don't have access to those opportunities, it's not about their individual skill sets. It's about the opportunity and the resources to make stuff happen. When I worked in a gap year program, and I worked in an organization that had the gap year program and then a youth college access and readiness program. And my kids on my gap year program paid about $35,000, $40,000 a year to work with us for 1 year. They lived in their dorms. And when they had needs like, mental health related, they got therapists, they got medicine, right? When they needed coaching on life skills, they had me as a life coach to be their full-time beck and call. Here's my cell phone number. They needed opportunities in terms of connecting with internships they were interested in. I set it up for them, right? Like that was my job. When I had my college access readiness kids, which were first in their family to go to college, I worked with them from the end of middle school all the way through their first year of college. Many of my kids couldn't afford to go see a therapist, or they didn't have the means or the advocacy on their parents' end. They didn't know how to advocate to get them a therapist. Many of them didn't have access to some of the prescription medicine or other medical things that they need. They didn't have really, outside of sort of the college accessibility support, any support in their individual lives besides sort of the support that the organization provided to them to help them develop and gain these skill sets, right? So it's the idea of like, if I have resources or connections, it's not, people know, right? It's not just about like being good at something. It's about being good and having a network to get what you need to get, right? There's a far difference if like I'm the first in my family to join the fire department than if I have my father, my uncle, my grandfather, my cousins on the fire department. Their history and knowledge to help guide me is ultimately what's going to help be beneficial for me to be successful, right? And I always say this to I'm from Worcester, and I'm Italian. I'm Black and I'm Italian. So I say this to a lot of my Italian friends and sort of leaders in the community of Worcester, that if we look at the models in terms of like community jobs and the ways in which many immigrant populations came in and used that to create a foundation, right? The Irish, the Italians, it's a perfect model to you can replicate for other new immigrants and other communities and other people of color. Because in that space, what we're doing is you're seeing those communities be able to naturally sort of navigate those systems so they can get their nephews, their cousins, their nieces now, sisters into those positions by just simply mentoring and coaching them, right? And then advocating for them when possible. And then that allows for you to create a cycle where people now start to see, like, oh, this is the pipeline for me to getting into these sort of roles. Those roles, unless they're facilitated and created by the government to create those for communities of color, don't exist. And so then communities of color are having to navigate those, not as cohorts or groups, but as individuals, right? If you look at the way in which the government gave out land to white Europeans and gave them low interest loans, and in some cases gave them grants to move out west, and basically said, hey, here, this is your foundation, your stability, like, so you can build off of, and then didn't do it for communities of color. And you could talk about, post slavery, what is it they refer to it? I'm sorry, history. It's the redemption period of when Reconstruction. So folks get a little bit of land, right? And they start to do good. And then white folks get mad about that, so they get the land taken back. So then like there's like 4 or 5 years or 7 years, I think it was President Jackson, I can't remember, who sort of pulls that back. You can see sort of advancements happen when people get those resources, and as soon as those resources are taken away, they plummet, right? And so when you look at these outcomes, it's not that Black people are sicker, it's not that they eat worse, it's not that they have, it's the reality of like, we as people all innately are not that much different, but the opportunities that are available to us are drastically different. And people don't take the time to sort of ask the question as to why, like, why are these resources different? The media is very strong and very at manipulating us into sort of like this sort of segregated arguments that seem they're people are on different sides. And it's unfortunate because if we looked at the ways in which we all connect around oppression, right? If we look at the ways in which white folks in rural communities are facing oppression and poverty and how that mirrors many of the things that communities of color are facing in the inner city, we could actually find unity around the idea of like, no folks should be oppressed. You shouldn't work a full-time job in this country, full-time hours, and be below the poverty line. Healthcare should be a fundamental right for all individuals. It's under sort of the right to live life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's some basic commonalities that we all should be able to share that gets us further along. But it just takes folks being able to sort of think analytically about sort of like what's happening, what are people sort of throwing our way to try to distract us.
Yeah. You're right, but I think my question was about the opportunities. Like, don't exist for students even before they get into the school system, and you described it eloquently. Like there's so many different opportunities available, and a lot of it some of it just seems, going to the library is free.
Yeah.
Towns have a library where you can go, but you got to have somebody to be willing to take you, or to be able to take you. Willing. I apologize for that. It's not willing. It's able, because for any number of reasons. It's preschool. I was fortunate. My kids, I live in Boston. My kids were able to get pre-K as opposed to starting off in kindergarten.
Yep.
And they were able to get into the system earlier than students who don't have a pre-K in their system, which enables them to not only experience all the things that you just described, Joe, about opportunities, in books and people reading to them and people taking time with them, but it also goes back to your thought a couple of minutes ago about food insecurity. So now that they're in the system, now that you can help them in a lot of other services as well that may not have been available. So I think your points about opportunity are right on, are I don't know what the word I'm trying to say is. Jay, help me out here. But I think, thank you for the thoughts. So I'm bumbling and stumbling here. So Jay, anything to add to that at all? Or?
I think you're absolutely correct with him being on point or hitting the nail on the head, whatever euphemism or, allegory you want to use to describe it. I think one of the things that in that same article, I believe it's the new superintendent in that area, she talks about how this idea of resilience, which is a very common word in Nye's work, right? We hear about the word resilience from students all the time. Yeah, grit, and how we need to remove that. And for our audience, they might not know why this idea of like how grit is this like word that's laced with inequity. Yeah. And maybe we can talk about that for a minute.
There are some really traumatic experiences that our kids have gone through in this district, and they show up every day. And maybe they don't have like the A. Some of them got the A, some of them got the B. Some of them maybe having C's, D's, maybe some of the F's, right? But they're showing up, right? My point being that there's kids that have experiences as young as elementary that are showing much more grit and resilience than I could ever imagine or hope for. So the idea to imply that they need more, it just tells me that adults who believe in that are significantly underestimating or unknowledgeable about the personal experiences that these children have. What our kids need is opportunity, right? And so if you look at the 26%, like we look every year, it's like on average, Framingham has about 26% of our kids who come in every year that don't have any pre-K experience, right? By no fault of their own, right? On average, I think it's like 10,000 maybe or more for a pre-K seat in the district or in the community, right? So for no fault of their own, they just can't afford it. They don't have pre-K. Now, we know that pre-K research shows that pre-K experience is crucial in terms of the development of a young person and getting them ready for school and having long-term success within their educational path. So if my kid doesn't get pre-K and I got another kid that goes into pre-K, is my kid any less talented or special or whatever the terminology when you're gifted than the other kid? No, they just had an opportunity. In fact, what we actually see across the spectrum in terms of ways in which we try to analyze education and higher education is that most of the tests that we use are all biased. And there's no real data point other than like sort of like social emotional skills and the ability for somebody to like have self-efficacy, to communicate strongly, like, right? Those skills are the ones that actually determine your ability to have like long-term success in life. But everything else is like a metric that may give you sort of like some level of your success on a standardized test. They're not really compatible like long-term with an individual student's ability to be successful in life, right? SATs doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be successful in life. You could pass the have a great score in SATs. It doesn't mean you're going to be great in college. It means it's going to up your chances to be getting into a more competitive school, right? So it means that you have mastered sort of like the test. Doesn't mean you're not taking away from like, you know, an individual kid's ability or brilliance. I'm just saying that you can look at the report that Boston Public Schools did on their like, was it like 26 years, 30 years of their valedictorians and where are they now? And it clearly showcased that being a valedictorian, top of your class academically doesn't mean success. I'll give a further example, and cut me off if you need to. I'm on a table with a community college, and we were at a speaking panel about biotechnology firms in the Metro West area. And one of the firms, I'll never forget, the owner got up and said, you know, I hire people that come from like Ivy League schools, like top of their tier. I pay them well. They come in, and he's like, you know what I had to do for my staff? I had to actually create a course on how to collaborate, because I was hiring people out of college that were top in their class, but they didn't know how to collaborate or communicate with each other. And it was impacting my business. So I had to send them back to school to learn how to, with each other, to learn how to communicate and work together effectively. And I'm like, this is like SEL. Like, you know, our director of health and wellness, Judy Stars, doing this work in the district. We're literally teaching our kids this work now, like how to communicate, how to collaborate, how to work through problems and challenges, right? How to have like self-efficacy. It's unbelievable. And it's not based on the idea of like that your academics alone is going to get you over in life, right? Because it's based on the idea that, you know, there's holistic needs that have to be met for someone to actually be happy and successful. And then what does that actually look like, right? Like, because if your success in terms of a district is like I'm top 10 in the state in terms of our high schools and all this other kind of nonsense, I'm like, yeah, but like how happy are your kids, right? Like look at the Metro West health indicator data. Are your kids happy? Do they feel like they're supportive? They feel like they leave school and feel ready for the world. They feel like they have positive adults. So they feel like they can be themselves within school, right? Look at our sub-demographic groups in terms of like our queer students, our trans students, our students of color. Like, do they have the same kind of rates as their white counterparts or their general ed population? Because if they don't, then it tells me that that's not an environment that's conducive or healthy, and that's areas for us to be actively working on, right? There's actual real indicators that determine our kids' happiness and their success. And we have that data readily available. We could be using that more to paint, I think, a more holistic vision of like what success means for us as a district. So we got 26% of our kids coming into this district that don't have universal pre-K. And the district as a form of like active step in terms of being anti-racist, and also as a form of taking like a step in terms of towards equity, we're launching our first phase this fall of a universal pre-K program. So there'll be 70 universal pre-K seats that'll be specifically directed towards that 25% of kids, that 176 plus kids each year that don't have universal pre-K access. So our goal is to, within the next 2 or 3 years, to eliminate that gap first. And then our next step is to try to find ways to subsidize those costs and reduce those costs for all families, because pre-K should be the same sort of level of access as a kindergarten program.
All right. Well, I was going to ask another opportunity question, but I think you kind of covered that pretty well. So let me ask you this. Jay and I, we on campus here, we've been using the documentary, which you can find on Peacock, called Black Boys. Mm-hmm. That's what kind of inspired us to kind of talk about the topics we're talking about. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, Joe. It's a wonderful, well done documentary about, how Black boys are seen in a number of just different systems. And we were fortunate to have a panel about it on our campus a couple months ago. Yep. And we were joined by one of the, Jay and I we were just observers of it. But we were joined by one of the people who was in there. And the question was asked, and I'd love to get your input on this. The question was asked, why don't we have more Black men or men of color teaching our students, especially in elementary ed situations? So I'd love to, because there was a really great and impactful response. And I guess I'll give it to you. I wanted to see where you're willing to go with it, but I guess I'll just give it to you. And he got the panelists said That's not the question to be asking. The question is, what is the system doing to Black boys to make them not want to get into elementary education or even higher education, not higher, but into education as a whole? So I'm curious, from somebody who does this, could you offer your thoughts on, what his comments were? And I thought they were impactful.
I mean, I'd be interested. Tell me why you think they're impactful. I'll throw my comment, but I want to throw it back at you. Why do you think they're impactful?
From my perspective, it puts it back on the system.
Yep.
It's the system and it talks about all the discipline that happens on a disproportionate ratio between Black students or students of color and white students. And, of course, it comes back to the opportunity gap and access to things. So it's not just one answer, but it's definitely a lot of it has to do with how Black students are seen, especially when it comes to discipline and what they're doing versus what their white what their white counterparts are doing.
Yep.
And implicit biases in how people are seeing Black boys. When I gather from that. So you can tell me if I'm off base on that, if I'm somewhere close, but I think that's what he was getting at from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I often make the same comment in terms of, if you think about the data outcomes and ask yourself, if I'm in a public school, if I'm in a school setting, if I'm in any kind of environment, and the outcomes for me show that I'm going to have a more challenging experience, am I going to feel as welcomed or as, like I'm supposed to be part of that system? And if the answer is no, or it's less likely that I'm going to feel as welcomed or feel as comfortable in that system, then why would I want to be in that system? Like, I left public education and I was like, I'm never coming back. My last day of high school, I thought that would be the last time I ever stepped foot in a school until I had kids and needed to bring them in. I never thought I'd be working within a public school system. And in fact, a lot of the work that I did with youth was intentionally outside of a public school system because I felt nervous about the idea of the way in which the system would respond to my level of thinking, my ideology around youth development, and some of the challenges that I have personally, like the sort of the concerns I had in terms of personal experience in the school. I had an amazing experience in this respect that I had some really great educators who changed my life. Miguel Almestica, my school district counselor, changed my life. Dave Elworthy, my vice principal, and probably one of the reasons I was able to graduate on time as a teen dad from high school, changed my life. And I can also rattle off names of teachers that changed my life for the negative, right? And I think part of what my own personal development and growth, not to go on a tangent, was that I had to learn to stop trying to prove people wrong, and because that energy was just too negative, and lean in more so on the folks that were cheerleading me on. But from my perspective, like, I really struggled as a Black kid in school, and the lack of, men of color really made it hard for me in terms of not having like a lot of role models. The way in which people behave towards me, right, and were allowed adults behave towards me and was challenging for me, and the best way I could describe it would be like disrespectful. I felt disrespected on a regular basis. People were allowed to make comments at me, to control me, to manipulate situations, and I was always seen as the person that was had the least level of credibility. That's hard. And then you want me to come back and work with kids? I'm good. Like, especially given that sort of like public educators are underpaid, public education is underfunded. There's heightened levels of scrutiny, right? Like, look at, if you look at the history, right? And let's go back to history of, segregated schools. School segregation ends, right? And you have to take kids in. Doesn't mean you have to take in the staff. So where did all those Black educators and educators of color go? Well, I think if you look at the data, I think it's like almost half of them were eliminated from the workforce when segregated schools ended because schools, white schools didn't want to take in some of those Black educators, right? So there's a legacy of that, right? So there's an introduction into the system of like, well, this is not a place for you, right? And then the culture that's been permeated since doesn't necessarily exude the greatest place of like welcomingness. So the conversation has to always be around like, like what are we doing to try to facilitate space at a young age for kids to be engaged and involved? In the district, we're working with Framingham State and Mass Bay on our Early Scholars program, right? Metro West Early Scholars, getting kids as early as middle school into career pathway programs, having some mentoring and coaching, right? We took our whole out of school time programs, which used to be outsourced to the community, brought them internal so we can mentor young students of color who are interested in education careers. We can provide them support. They can have regular increases in pay where they can get youth development work by working in these after school programs, summer programs, before school programs. And we're seeing these young people now transition into, once they finish their degree, transitioning into other full-time positions within the district, right? Because we're trying to cultivate the space of like, we want you, we need you, your skill sets, your language, diversity you bring is of value, and we want to see that supported, right? We create the affinity spaces to try to create the spaces for our staff, whatever identity that they carry, to feel affirmed in their existence, to connect with peers, so they don't feel isolated alone within this work. There's got to be multiple strategies in terms of how you integrate people into this work. And if we want young Black men to do this work, then we've got to incentivize young Black men to do this work, because up until now, Black people in general, especially Black men, have been de-incentivized or non-incentivized, whatever the word is, in terms of working in public education. When I had when I got transitioned from youth work to like more systemic educational stuff, right? Like wraparound zones and all that kind of stuff. I got a chance to go to Harlem and visit. I spent a week out there with the Children's Zone to learn about some of their community-based organizations, community-based work with schools, with the New York public school system, as well as work they do within their institution. And I was amazed walking into a pre-K program that they had in Harlem, right? And I saw young men of color in almost every room. And I was like, yo, how did you get these young men? They said, you know what we did? We pulled a list from the high schools of all the young men of color who didn't matriculate into a community college. And then we went out to their house and we were like, yo, we'll give you a job. And after 3 months, you've got to be enrolled in 2 classes at the community college. And we'll give you a pay incentive. So if you stay on for a year, like they had built a system directly around what they were trying to build. And I was like, wow, this is nuts. And then they said, now ask them what their results are, what their, their accountability, what their data is. You start talking to them and they start saying, well, these are my data points that I've got to have for this kid. I got to get him on pace for this and on this. And, this, and they start talking about their goals. And like, I thought I was like getting like a briefing from like a finance report. Like they were so knowledgeable about like their data and what their kids are at. And I was like, this is like phenomenal. And I'm like, this can be replicated. Right? It's not rocket science. It's like the idea of like thinking strategically around like, what do you want? And then in being innovative enough and having enough hustle to actually do it, right? Put your resources where you put your mouth, and then put some intentionality around like how you want to cultivate and develop those folks. What happens too often is people just like try to take like the one size fits all. We're gonna go to all the diversity fairs and we're gonna work on one-offs. Sort of like a higher, the one-offs. It's like the one-offs. It's like that stuff works sometimes. It works. It's part of the process. So I don't want to take away from it, but you got to have tailored strategies, right? Like if I want to go and if I want to increase women in sciences, like have more girls at the high school get into sciences, it's not just about the academics. Like I got to prepare them to go into a field that is dominated by men, and to be able to sustain themselves, right? Like sustain themselves in a way of like, you're going to meet like probably a lot of like misogyny and sexism. And I don't want to teach you how to cope with it. More so I want to teach you how to like break through it, right? To sustain yourself and your values and not having to conform to that environment. But I also want to be conscious enough to be able to like work with you. So that way, when you face it, it's not like a challenge. Like my kids went to college after my college access program. I know these are first in their family to go to college. Then you come back and say, Joe, the academics are hard. The academics were challenging because there was a harder course load. The hardest part was the social piece. They're like, there's a lot of white kids. They say a lot of really offensive things. I don't really know what to do. And it makes me really irritated when people look at me in the class all the time and expect me to be like the token and speak about like from the Dominican or the Latino or the Black or the Asian perspective, right? And I'm like, wow, like that's that's a strategy that we have to cultivate also, I guess is what I'm saying,
there's a really good book about that came out 2 or 3 years ago called the Doubly Disadvantaged. Mm-hmm. And he writes about that specifically. He spends a year on a campus as part of it. I think it was part of his doctoral dissertation as well. But he talks exactly what you were just describing about when students go off to college and what they see and what they hear and stuff. It's excellent. It was a good eye opener for me as well as I was reading about that stuff. But so Jay, you want to? I know you've got some questions as well, or at least get into the community thing. But go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to stay on this idea of how students are influenced. We talked a lot about performance in the first part of our conversation, and now we started talking a little bit more about the environment, right? We took like mentors, role models, people that they're seeing, the messages that students are getting, and then there's just so much more to education than the academic side of things. Right. Like Ben and I, we support academics, but the work that we do is entirely outside of the classroom. Like I work with students where there's behavioral concerns sometimes, and then other times it's just allegation. We have to process that duly. Right. But the thing is, there's so much to education and how students are influenced. And Ben made an allusion to school to prison pipeline before. And you would use the word holistic, right? Looking at that, like the entire environment and how we're educating our students. I'm wondering if you can kind of comment a little bit about the behavioral discrepancies that we're seeing, like how students are treated. You referenced it a little bit in how you felt you were disrespected, right? Just straight up, you were disrespected during your time in public education. And how that is persisting in education today and how we can combat that.
Yeah, it's tough because it plays into sort of like the interpersonal pieces around racism, and the interpersonal, I think, is where a lot of folks get caught up in terms of like the hyper focus around like, tell me about like where, in terms of race, like where the bias kicks in on that one-to-one level. I feel like someone doesn't like me. I feel like they treat me different. That's really hard to an investigation is really, it can be hard to prove, right? Like data is like is a friend in that sense that it can tell us a pattern, right? Like if I get referrals from, if I'm a principal, I'm getting referrals from a teacher, and all the referrals are like students of color, I might say, hey, did you know you sent me like 15 referrals the past 3 weeks and they're all young men of color, right? Same way I could say, hey, did you notice that you sent me the last 5 referrals and they're all students with special needs? Like, let's talk about this. Like, let's have a conversation about it. Because bias and the way that bias works is that, our brain's just taking shortcuts. Our brain's trying to understand things. They're taking shortcuts. They're trying to make sense of things. And so sometimes the shortcuts that it takes causes hardship, So it's subtle things, right? Like who do you notice in terms of behavior? Who's the kid that irritates you? Like there might be some kids that like misbehave and you let it slide because they're like, oh, they misbehave, but they're kind of cute, or they're like nice, or I like them, or, they misbehave in this way, but I got a special place in my heart for them. These are the kids that you're like really could be intolerant about, right? Who are the kids that like, that you always speak to with a soft voice, and who are the kids that you're very just sort of like objective, or not objective, but more so like direct to the point in terms of conversation. Those things play a role in terms of the way in which we engage and the level of comfort in which kids feel with us. And so it's simple things like, do we treat every instance? Is there clarity or consistency in terms of how we address every instance of discipline, or is it inconsistent, right? If a kid gets into a fight, is everybody getting the same level of suspension in terms of days? Or no? We're doing the code of conduct now, so we're looking at that. We're talking about like, so there's accountability and discipline. Like, what are like the expectations around discipline? I can tell you right now, like across the schools, it all varies, right? And in there are people making decisions based on their own knowledge and best wills and intentions, right? But then there's bias, right? So for some people, they might say, you know what, this is a fight. This fight's 3-day suspension. Another person will say, well, this is a fight. This might be 1-day suspension. But the variance in it, right, and their ability to administer that creates a challenge, because in there, when the bias kicks in and they're not conscious of it, they might have given a 2-day suspension for the same thing a month ago. And in this situation, maybe give out a 1-day suspension, right? And when we look at the data, people can say whatever in their mind, what they want to say. But we look at the data in terms of discipline, we see disproportionately our students of color, our students with special needs, our English learners are the ones who are receiving the most levels of discipline. Now, the question you have to ask is, do they behave in a way in which they are misbehaving more than white students? And I don't think you'd find an administrator or any research that would support that, right? So there's a consciousness and there's way in which, right, like your neighbor, you act up and your neighbor says, this is Johnny's kid, I'm going to tell your mother, right? Like there's different, the idea of chastising the kid and saying, you're doing wrong, I'm going to let your mama know, than being like cursing the kid out in the neighborhood that you don't know, right? Like our responses to kids are indicated by our own level of humanization that we have for them. So if we see kids and we're not responding to them in a way in which is consistent, regardless of their identities, right? Or then we're essentially, to what I say is, we dehumanize them. In that space, where we've got to really do some reflection as adults about the space we're creating for kids.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a really good way to put it, right? Is that we as the adults in that situation are the people who are a part of this system, right? We have to do the work to assess how we're actually treating, what are our biases, what can we do to mitigate those biases, and how can we just create paths towards equity for students.
Yeah. So like, Jay, like, you ever had a kid that you like really liked, like they, like maybe you make exceptions for them?
Yeah, I mean, now that I'm making exceptions for people, but yeah, like you want to, right? There's something in your mind you're like, oh, they're trying so hard. Like, I wish I could go an extra mile for them,
I got kids all the time that like coming up, like they did something. I feel like, I don't know what it is, but we just connect on some kind of level where I like you and I like see what you're trying to do, and you kind of be breaking the rules a little bit, and I create the exception. But my job in that is to be like, with the best intent of trying to create that exception, like, what's the consistency in terms of the folks that I create the exception for, right? Are they all males, right? For me, are they all males of color? Are they all like, females? Like, is this like, and what's that based out of? Like, where is that coming from? Like, why am I, because like the discovery and the reflection piece is what allows us to be constantly checking our biases, right? Because if I'm checking that and I ask myself then, like, well, where am I not creating exceptions, right? Where are people that I'm being, what are the consistency in terms of the personalities or identities of the folks where I'm sort of being the opposite with, and I start to see what some of those commonalities are, then I got to just be really intentional of unpacking that, because whether it's intentional or not, the harm is harm. And nobody I personally believe all people are good. Nobody wants to cause harm. But unless we're unpacking it on a regular basis, then we are inherently causing harm,
Yeah.
And, say, Joe, I think you touched on a very, very, very important point too about analyzing the data. A lot of times, I think what a lot of times people do is they think that what they're doing is, they're doing whatever they're doing, and then when you take a look at the data, like you described, like you've got 15 kids as your description, you've disciplined 15 students of color over the past 3 months, and you take a look at that, and especially when you disaggregate data. But, one thing that we all have a defense mechanism for, which I think you talk about well, is the perfectly logical explanation type of thing, right?
Yeah.
Always have a logical explanation. Well, that's not really what is really happening, or this and that. Well, and that takes a lot for people to be able to take to look at the disaggregated data and say, this could be a problem, as opposed to getting defensive right from the start. Mm-hmm. So you certainly have to, but I think looking at your data when you recognize that there's a potential problem is a really important piece. And also being willing to not blow it aside by just coming up with some perfectly logical, I think that's the phrase that our VP has used, a perfectly logical explanation or what people perceive as a perfectly logical explanation. So I do appreciate that a lot, that you're being able to look at the data, especially in things that you and Jay are doing as far as discipline or conduct or things like that, because it makes people realize, like, well, look, like, let's talk about this at least. Yeah. So I appreciate that you offered that thought as well. So, do we want, let's get into, so, we've talked about a lot of different points here about the education system. I literally asked 2 questions, and we've been spending the past 45 minutes and
yeah, just runs.
Well, this is perfect, because this is exactly what we want. The last thing we want is be peppering you with questions. But you've talked about a lot of different points within the education system. So can you talk a little bit about, like, not only what does this do, what are some of these acts that we've talked about, or lack of access or lack of opportunity? 2-part question. What does it do to communities when this happens? What is it, what is this lack of access, lack of opportunity, what you were describing before, which I think is an excellent phrase. What does this lack of opportunity do for people in the community as a whole? And then how can we work on this to make our communities better? Because this is really about community conversation. Mm-hmm. What does it do? And then what can we do?
Well, like the lack of opportunity just perpetuates the cycle. So it ensures that folks that are poor, marginalized, and otherized continue to be so, right? And so what you can do about it is, as an individual, is to work to be anti-racist, right? Because anti-racist deconstructs the system, and within your whatever respective role that you have, if you're a politician, if you're a finance, if you're a doctor, if you're a banker, if you work at an institution like myself and our institutional leader, like ask yourself, like, what are you doing in terms of your practices, your policies, and your resources? It's simple as that. Because the answer is there, and people can surmise like where it's going in terms of sort of this work. Like it's about the evaluation of ourselves, our systems, and then how we allocate resources to address those. And I think oftentimes people don't want to engage because they recognize that they might mean a sense of difference and change, and people don't like that. And particularly for folks who, people have a very dismissive on the idea of privilege, and I don't know privilege, and and some of that is just sort of like rebuttal, and some of it is just sort of like education, but some of it is also defense mechanism, right? Because the accessing privilege, folks are good about knowing what change and privilege means, right? Like people, when they feel like their power is threatened, get very proactive in terms of pushing down and pushing away and pushing up against anyone who's trying to change sort of those power structures, because they're scared about what it means for them. And they know that whatever it means, it's going to mean a change in terms of their ability to access power, right? Because even if I go from if I end up at a place of sharing power, right, equally, but I started as a place of having all power or having more power, then inherently I've lost some level of power. And folks just need to know that's what it's going to mean. It's going to mean like a changing of the ways in which people can access power. And as scary as that is, isn't it scary that like some folks just based on their identities are able to access greater levels of power than others? Like, isn't that like scary? Like not you didn't do anything to necessarily earn it or whatever. You're just inherently given it because of the color of your skin, your gender, your sexual orientation, right? Like your faith. Like that's crazy, right? And like and the way it works, like oppression works like a link fence. You can't just try to cut one link off of the chain. Like you gotta get rid of the entire chain of oppression, right? Like, and that's where like the intersectionality takes place, and the work has to take place on varying levels of all identities around like, how do we like actually deconstruct this? Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have intentional conversations and platforms and strategies around specific levels of oppression, because there's different levels of oppression, and there's greater depths in which people feel or experience those levels, right? Like racism and slavery is like real deep, right? Like it's embedded in this country, and the years of it are substantial in terms of their impact. And there's plenty of data to showcase like I'm not going to compare it to any other sort of level of oppression. I'm going to say that on the scale of like the greatness of oppression, it is one of the top of my scales, right? But it just means that like when we're having these levels of conversation and intentionality and creating the spaces, it's important as if we're experiencing it ourselves, right? Or we're allies or some would say co-conspirators in the work in terms of trying to dismantle it, that we're concentrating and creating the space to deal with it, while also having an intentional mind of intersectionality. So we go into Black conversations, don't disrupt and try to not talk about racism because you feel uncomfortable and you'd rather talk about something that you feel more comfortable with, right? And let's talk about students with special needs. Let's talk about, queer folks. Let's talk about undocumented immigrants. Like when when we're gearing up to have a conversational strategy about dismantling racism, let's keep those in our minds because people have multiple identities, but let's not be afraid to like delve into the work because we're scared or uncomfortable with it. Saying it goes the opposite way, right? If I'm going to a meeting or a rally or some planning meeting on like trying to create inclusion for queer trans folks, then this is what the conversation is about. And anything else that people don't, because they don't feel comfortable, they want to sort of relate to things that they can identify with, that makes them feel more comfortable, that distracts from the conversation and takes away. And like, there's places and times for us to have sort of the intersectional conversation. We should always have an intersectional mind, but there's also places where we need to have an intentional conversation around the specific identities that are experiencing the hardship, given the topic or in the moment,
Yeah. And so that talks a little bit about, interpersonally, right? Like we need to have conversations, and in order for us to all understand, and that's why it's important for us to take on anti-racist perspective and like be that, right?
Yeah.
How about in terms of systems? Like what would be signs that the systems are changing for the better? Like, are there things that we can do to influence like the structure of education, whether at the collegiate level or at the, you know, the K through 12 level, that we could look forward to change?
Yeah, I mean, I would look at, like, if you're talking about in terms of education or higher ed, I'd look at what programming do you have developed that's like specific and unique to, you know, students of color, right? Like, how are you investing or creating pathways or resources that are specific to communities of color, right? Like, if you want to dismantling racism, if you want to create more opportunities, like, your work is going to be the indicator in terms of if you're moving or progressing, not necessarily your dialogue, right? So if I'm looking at a higher ed institution and wondering like what they're doing in terms of becoming anti-racist, what's happening in terms of your professional development? Is it mandated? Is it optional? Is it in your contracts? And whose contract is it in? Because if it's just in the professors or the adjunct, then that doesn't do anything for me. I want the president to have it in his contract or her contract, right? You see what I just did there? I see I said president and I started with he, assumption, right? So that's me checking myself, jumping to her. So it's that constant reflection. We all are imperfect within this work, but it's that the simple things, right, of acknowledging and challenging ourselves to be more inclusive, which is important. But, you know, like when I'm looking at higher ed or educational institutions, I want to know where you put your dollars at, your resources. I want to know where you stand on issues when they come up. Are you talking about them? Are you in the forefront? Are you waiting for other districts to respond? Are you responding, right? I always say to teachers, when someone comes into your community, are they a part of the conversation, right? Are they included in text message dialogue that's happening that people don't always put on Jump Street? Or are they part of, you know, like, are they the conversation in the text message, right? Because we got a lot of folks that are screaming that they're anti-racist and they're about diversity, equity, inclusion. And as soon as they get somebody that they don't like, they start text messaging and side messaging about them and talking junk about them and all that other nonsense, which is just a form of it's just a characteristic of the oppressor, I say, right? Like, it's a way in which we otherize people. It's just generally not nice, right? But those are things that we do to push people out that we don't like. And when we get down to the nitty gritty of why we don't like them, oftentimes it's based on the idea that they have a difference around a philosophy, ideology, a way of thinking, maybe a way of behaving culturally, non-culturally, you know, whatever, that just conflicts with ours. And it's just like, yo, why can't we coexist? Why can't we be in a place where our differences actually drive us together? Because I'm appreciative, respectful, and value of you and your difference and what you bring, and you're appreciative and value of me. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So like when I'm looking at institutions, like I'm over here like Cuba Gooding Jr. Like, show me the money, show me where you spending the dollars at. If you love, you know, Black kids and you want them to be educators, like, show me how you're incentivizing them. Because everywhere else in the world, if you want someone to do something, you incentivize them. You want to have somebody make more money in the finance, you give them a bonus, right? You want to have somebody grow in your organization, you develop a leadership pathway program to, you know, executive leadership pathway to accelerate their vertical or their horizontal, whatever their vertical growth in your organization. So show me as a higher education institution, as a public education institution, where you're doing this for Black kids, for brown kids, for immigrant students, for queer students, for our students who are immigrants but undocumented. Like, show me how you're actually creating those pathways, and I'll tell you what you're doing in terms of like this racial justice work.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up our session. Jay, you agree? Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So, Joe, we really we want to thank you for all of your thoughts. There are so many great points that you've made here today. It talks about education systems, about opportunities, about finance and using finances. You know, everything you just talked about right now, putting your money where your mouth is, and not just, I think a lot of times too, we rely, higher education anyways, relies on one office to handle the diversity types of issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm sure that you feel a lot of that weight, Joe, on your shoulders as based on what your title is, and a lot of people look to you. Well, that's Joe's responsibility, and I think institutions as a whole have to do a better job of saying it's not one person's responsibility. This one person or this one person's department or office may be leading it or providing wonderful guidance, but it's the entire institutions to figure out where is the money coming from? who are we going to be involving in this? How are we going to get professional development involved into our own departments type of thing? You know, it involves it's okay to have one central office, like for Joe, maybe for you in Framingham, or for what we have here, but it has to be an entire institution. Otherwise it's just a struggle.
Yeah, because inevitably, like, you know, and you're Framingham State, so shout out to Dr. Cabello, who's the vice president up there for your diversity and equity work for FSU. I'm sure she would tell you that these positions are lonely positions. Yes. Because you are literally the face of, like, you know, this institutional oppression that has existed. So people are like, you're the face of the district, you need to fix this. And there's like the accountability and expectations for like dismantling years of like of oppression. And then you're also the hope, right? And so you have to speak in one way in which you give hope, but you also have to speak for the folks who don't feel comfortable vocalizing publicly like their issues or concerns. And what's the first thing that happens when people do that? They demonize you. They otherize you. So, right. So like, I've got to maintain relationships while I challenge people on like their practices. Like, imagine like that sort of like tightrope, right? Like, how do you get people to like you while also challenge them to like do better? It is hard, you know, because sometimes I don't necessarily always have hope in a situation. I'll credit my superintendent, Dr. Tremblay. He says at almost every meeting, like, equity is not Joe's job. Joe's job is to facilitate the work and to lead the work, but it's all our responsibilities to also actively lead the work in our respective departments and in our schools. And so, like, every meeting now, he literally says, like, this isn't Joe's responsibility alone. We all own this, and I want to see people taking ownership. And he practices it himself, right? So like when you have leadership that does that on a day-to-day basis and and showcases the vulnerability of like, yo, I'm gonna mess up, but it's okay, and I'm gonna give you space to mess up because in this work, it's not gonna be clean, it's gonna get messy, but we got your back. Like, then people are gonna start to feel like they can spread their wings and try things out. They're gonna try lesson plans. They're gonna try developing courses. They're gonna try developing programs, and it's gonna be imperfect, and that's cool. Because we're trying, and that's what the whole work is. Like, we got to try. We got to let people know we're trying, you know, because otherwise we're just like, you know, mice on the spinning wheel, staying in place, running in circles, talking about equity and inclusion, and actually not really getting anywhere on it, you know.
And we were talking about role models, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if we want our students to be engaged in this, if we want our community members to also be a part of solutions, they need to see us trying. They need to see the institution putting the money in certain places. They need to actually feel the commitment, because I think there were several years, you know, where institutions, including our own, I think, where it, you know, we were saying like, yes, there's a CDIO, but it's everybody's work.
Mm-hmm.
But I only think we just started touching the precipice of it, where, you know, it really is everybody's work to start talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, well, Joe, thank you so much for your time, your insight. You've offered so many different, your own experiences, and we appreciate that a lot. It's not always easy to do. So thank you very much for sharing from two people we've never met before at all. So I appreciate it a lot. And your contributions to our series are really helpful, and we're hoping that a lot of people will benefit from it as well. So, Joe, thank you so much.
No problem. I appreciate you all giving me the time. It's good to meet you.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. We really loved having you. And thanks everybody for joining us on the podcast. Till next episode.
Thank you.
For more information on the topics we discussed in this episode, you can visit these resources. For more information about our support resources here at Framingham State, you can visit these offices.
We'd like to thank Buyer Ads for their technical support, as well as NASPA Region 1 for their generous financial support. And of course, we'd also like to thank the Offices of Community Standards and New Student and Family Programs on the Framingham State campus for making this happen.